can now listen to full-length, commercial-free episodes of the Divorcing Religion podcast on Patreon. Please sign up at patreon.com/Janice Selby or click the link in the show notes. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and religious recovery consultant. We're recording today's episode on September 30th, which is Truth and Reconciliation Day across Canada. On this day, we wear orange shirts bearing the motto, "Every Child Matters," as a way to honor the memories of the thousands of Indigenous children stolen from their parents and forced to attend Indian residential schools and day schools. These schools were essentially prisons for children, frequently run by very abusive priests and nuns. Many of these children died or were killed while at residential schools, with their parents never being told what happened to them, and they number in the thousands. It seems fitting today to speak with a champion of children's rights. Ryan Stollar is my guest today on the Divorcing Religion podcast. Co-founder of the viral website Homeschoolers Anonymous, Ryan is also a researcher, advocate, and author. He was homeschooled from kindergarten through high school graduation before attaining both a Master of Human Services in Child Protection and a Master of Arts in Eastern Classics. Ryan is a child liberation theologian, and his recent book is called The Kingdom of Children. Welcome, Ryan Stollar.
Thank you so much for having me, Janice.
It's nice to see you again. I haven't seen you since we worked together on the recent conference on religious trauma, and you spoke on our panel about homeschooling and religious school.
Yes. That was an excellent panel. I think that the issue of what religious schools have the ability to do in terms of their rights and freedom, and the extent to which those are so often used and abused by those in power in those schools. I think that's a hugely important issue, especially with the way the United States is lurching these days.
Yeah, it's and of course more people are homeschooling these days. It's become very well accepted in mainstream society. And some folks do it because they are deeply religious and they want to indoctrinate their children and protect them from Satan. That's why I homeschooled my children. And then others have no religious interest at all. Perhaps their child is being bullied, or maybe they just want their child to have the advantage of one-on-one teaching, because it really can be a tremendous way to receive an education, provided that social needs are also being met and taken care of.
Yeah, definitely. I think that homeschooling can be an amazing experience. And I think that, when homeschooling is done right, it's a very, children first kind of movement. And I think that's beautiful that, that we have the ability to and freedom to give children unique and tailored educations. I think that's, a very powerful aspect of homeschooling. At the same time, that's the aspect that also enables the other parents to do, the more fundamentalist and indoctrinating homeschooling ways, which is what I grew up with as an evangelical homeschool kid in the United States.
So there was a lot of indoctrination. See both sides.
Yeah.
I interviewed Jerusha, who was also on the homeschool panel, and she spoke some about being quite isolated as a result of the homeschooling that she received. Was that something that occurred for you as well, or did you have lots of involvement with kids?
There are two parts to that. Two answers I would give to that question. One would be that I had lots of involvement with, I had plenty of socialization in terms of interacting with peers. I was involved in a lot of different activities. My parents were the founders and directors of a homeschool co-op here in the Bay Area, California. So my family was pretty involved in a lot of different activities. We did sports days, we had debate clubs, and we had literature classes that we took with, we had these co-ops where different parents would get together and, based on what they knew, they would teach a subject. And so that aspect, I had a lot of, socialization with peers. On the other hand, they all looked like me and they all thought like me and they all acted like me. So there wasn't a lot of socialization in terms of like a diversity of experiences and exposing me to different viewpoints and different walks, ways of life. So most of the people that I interacted with were white evangelicals.
And you went on to attain 2 master's degrees. So do you feel that the homeschooling that you received education-wise was quite good?
I think it was excellent in some ways, and then it also had some shortcomings, which I probably is the case for just about any type of education one gets.
Sure.
But I had a lot of support around reading and writing. My mom is a writer and always encouraged us to write. She would bring in, tutors and other teachers to help us with writing. So I learned how to write really well. I also learned how to research and speak through doing speech debate in high school.
Nice.
So I definitely gained a lot of skills that have helped me throughout my life. I did have some shortcomings, like I didn't really get a lot of science. The science that I did get was not really science. It was, 6-day creationism. So it was more apologetics and learning how to attack evolution. So there were definitely some gaps, and with math, I kind of had to teach myself because neither of my parents were particularly good at that.
Wow.
So they kind of just gave us like the textbook.
Yeah.
And we went through the textbook. Oh yeah. And the best part of that story is that they also gave us the answer key because they didn't know how to grade it at some point. Once we got to algebra, it was beyond what they knew. So they would just give us the answer key.
Wow.
I will admit that I did cheat a few times, but
you're normal.
Yes. But I did make sure when I cheated that I still got a few wrong every time.
Okay.
So it wasn't obvious.
All right. Oh, that's so funny. And so your parents were obviously firm believers. And did you also maintain a firm belief all the way through? Was it a shock when you went to university and you learned actual science, or?
I had a very torturous relationship with my faith. I always had trouble sharing my testimony, which is something that evangelicals do. And maybe those listening and don't know what that is, but that's basically sharing your story of how you accepted Jesus into your heart and how you became a born again evangelical.
Right. At the age of 4 or something.
Yeah. And I mean, that was for me. I was 4 or 5, somewhere around there. And my older brother became a Christian. And the way it was expressed to me, I interpreted what they said was basically that I needed to accept Jesus into my heart, or I was going to spend eternity separated from my older brother. So
Oh dear.
I remember I cried.
Oh
as a kid,
yes.
and like I immediately accepted Jesus into my
Yeah, of course. Oh my
and I've
gosh.
devoted ever since. But
Oh.
when I hit like junior high and like started getting into the testimony expressing stage,
Mm-hmm.
I think I shared my testimony once, and like when I got to the end, I realized that's not like the sort of testimony they want to hear. Like they want something that's, very
They want something juicy.
dramatic or transformative or juicy or something. They don't want to know that like they traumatized the kid into accepting Jesus. So
That's right. Oh my gosh. And yet most times that is actually the case.
mhm. I didn't quite put that together at the time when I like shared the testimony, but I did realize like it landed wrong. Like as someone who's done lots of public speaking now, every now and again when something like lands wrong with the audience, and it was very clear even back then, like that I was like, oh, I said something that I probably shouldn't have said, I guess. So
And so were there doubts creeping in at that point, like wondering about, well, what is the validity of a decision when it's made under duress like that?
I never quite felt like at peace. And part of that is like when I was abused as a kid by a speech therapist, actually at a public school. Before I started being homeschooled, I was in some speech therapy, and actually homeschooling, as a side note, really helped me in that regard because the speech therapist worked at the public school that was right by our house. So I would have gone to that school, so I would have been around the person abusing me more if I had gone to public school. So I was actually spared a lot of pain in that regard. But I mean, because of that, like I was just always the kid that was acting out and was bad, and I was aware of that fact pretty early on and knew that, I felt like there was something wrong with me. And so I felt like I had to hide a lot from my parents. Like as a little kid, like I would shoplift candy from stores like on a very regular basis. So I was kind of had this like double life growing up.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that kind of, that definitely like influenced how I like felt and thought about God. Even to this day, like there was always this like kind of love and hate relationship, or feeling like, oh, this is good, but this is also really bad. Like I felt the conflict throughout my entire childhood.
And then, so it was maybe hard to have like a super close relationship with a deity that you maybe saw other kids professing to have when it was a really kind of hot and cold experience for you. Did you ever start wondering about whether this way is the only way?
Yeah, I probably reached that point most significantly when I first went off to grad school. So when after my undergrad, I went to a small liberal arts college in Eugene, Oregon. It's called Gutenberg College, and it's basically a college for homeschool graduates.
Okay.
Pretty much everyone that goes there is a homeschool graduate. So my college years were not any different really from my childhood. So for grad school, which was when I first turned 21 after leaving college, I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I was away from my family. I was away from friends. I literally knew no one there.
Wow.
And it was probably like a week into the master's program. I was just like watching the sunset, which if you've ever been to New Mexico, the sunsets are spectacular.
Oh, like that.
And I just had this like physical sensation of like all my beliefs slipping out of my body, because it was kind of the first time that I was around no one that would have expected or demanded anything from me. And I realized like I had no idea like who I was or what I believed. Like my entire life I had been told what to believe and what I was. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden there was nothing to, stop me or to encourage me in any direction. Like I could choose. And I realized I had no idea. Like, and I think the first week of grad school helped with that, like making me realize that there were other religions of such complexity that I had like zero concept or understanding of.
Right.
And how could I insist that I knew the right one? Like,
so you were really being exposed to different ideas.
Yeah. And I think it helped give me a soft landing too. Like it helped me see that there were these other religions and other attempts to understand like life and the universe, and that really like formed my perspective on religion for quite a while, like trying to see it more like from this perspective of people trying to make sense of life.
Yes. Yeah. And so here you are at grad school, and I love that powerful image you gave, watching the sun sinking, and then you're just feeling your beliefs slipping away that you had been raised with, and didn't really have a choice whether or not to accept those beliefs. It was just expected of you. And so was it, did you feel scared or excited? Like just, oh, well, I'm on a journey. I'm on my own adventure now. Or were you sad or?
I think I was probably all of those things. I would probably say I was probably felt like very confused at the time and very lonely in the sense of like not really feeling like I had a community that I could talk to about like the different changes I was going through.
Right.
Like at the time, there was not, Twitter or Facebook had just started. Like I remember when I was at grad school, like that was when Facebook still required you to have an email address from a college.
Oh, wow.
So like St. John's, which is where I got my first master's, they're a pretty well-established college, but they're still a pretty small one. So it took them a while to get the ability to let their students into Facebook.
Wow.
But so there really weren't a lot of ways to connect like there are today with the ex-evangelical community.
And we didn't even have, the words religious trauma. We weren't particularly familiar with those, and many of us never even heard of them back then. So that's definitely the sense that I'm getting of, someone who everything has just dissolved. Your worldview, everything, how you thought the world was ordered and everything is now up for grabs. And that can be really disorienting.
Yeah, it definitely was. It was liberating, and at the same time it was terrifying.
I've used those words exactly to describe how it was for me. So your first master's had to do with child protection, and so did that grow out of the abuse that you had suffered as a child from the worker at school? Like, was that a seed that was planted in you that I want to be able to protect kids from those things, or were there other things that factored into that?
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, my first master's was the Eastern Classics one.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, the answer to the story there is that after I got my master's, and I spent some time trying to process what I had been going through. I had been reconnecting with people that I knew from my childhood, other homeschool kids who are now adults. And I was seeing that we all had like very similar stories. And so that's what led me to create Homeschoolers Anonymous, which was a platform for homeschool alumni to share their stories about growing up in the evangelical homeschooling movement.
Wow. And that went viral, that website.
It did go viral. Yeah, we received millions of views.
Wow.
The website was covered in all sorts of media, like the New Yorker and Washington Post.
What was it like to get all that kind of publicity over something that you were doing?
It was very exciting, and it was also very difficult to kind of be the like face and to use I can't really think of a word that other than shepherd, which is a very evangelical word, but you know what I mean, like someone shepherding other people's stories of a lot of which were about abuse and neglect. So that was very challenging, especially with my own history. But
how were your parents reacting to this, or did you even talk to them about it, about the website?
They always had tried to be supportive of it. They definitely struggled with being supportive of it, though.
Yeah.
My mom actually wrote a blog post for the website at one point.
Interesting.
But so like they always expressed like appreciation for what I did. Like, and my parents were kind of quirky in their beliefs. Like they weren't very fundamentalist. They were very evangelical, but they weren't very fundamentalist. They didn't like the more extreme patriarchal elements in homeschooling. So a lot of the big names that like Bill Gothard or Doug Phillips, like they didn't really like them. But at the same time, my dad listened to Rush Limbaugh every day. Like there were pluses and minuses. So they did their best to be supportive, but at the same time, like my dad has never shared an article that I've written on his Facebook wall, whereas he's shared things from all my other siblings. So like there's definitely I see that they struggle with it. So
And so did were your folks aware? Did you share with them that you were questioning and challenging some of the beliefs that they had raised you with, or was that more of a private journey that you didn't feel the need to share with them?
I don't think that I didn't really share much with them about the journey along the way. At the same time, I don't think anything really like surprised them. I mean, in terms of like the things that I dealt with, as a little kid, that didn't improve at all as I grew older, because my parents, while they were not hardcore fundamentalists, like they still didn't really believe in like mental health issues. When my primary care physician recommended that I get on some medication, like they didn't do that. So, so I had a lot of struggles throughout my entire life, such that like I was never the good child, and I was always the rebellious one. So
wow.
I don't think that they have been shocked by my trajectory.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's definitely been it's challenged them, it's hurt them, like, and it's definitely made like connection difficult because of that.
Mm-hmm. Is that, do you feel the same with your siblings, or are they a bit more accepting? I think you're frozen there. There we go.
I feel like my siblings they've all had their own unique journeys. I think that they've gotten to a point now where they like can understand and appreciate the work I do, and like understand why I do it. And they're supportive of that. So, and that's something that I really appreciate.
Yes, for sure. Where does your advocacy work come in?
So after, doing Homeschoolers Anonymous for a while and shepherding these stories of abuse and neglect, and having to deal with my own, history of abuse, and I felt like I wanted to be more equipped and be able to help people in a more substantive way. And so I went back to school for child protection. And while studying for that master's, I just kept, the more I learned about child development and child advocacy and child rights, I just became increasingly horrified by so many of the beliefs and practices that I grew up with in evangelicalism. And so that really like inspired me to try to figure out how to challenge those beliefs and practices from kind of the inside. Because I know that those communities are so insular and so isolated, it's really hard to break through. And so sometimes you have to take the battle to where they are. And so that's what I have been inspired to do in the last few years, and through my advocacy work, through writing about child liberation theology, and continuing and writing about the homeschooling and evangelical communities.
Please tell us, what is child liberation theology? Until I'd met you, I'd never heard of such a thing.
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to start would be to explain liberation theology.
Okay.
Liberation theology is a branch of Christian theology, and it was started by James Cone, who is a Black American theologian, and then also Gustavo Gutierrez, who is a Peruvian theologian. And I would say liberation theology, the easiest way to explain it is that it's a theology of self-determination. So it is about equipping and empowering marginalized people groups to think about and speak about God and religion on their own terms and in their own ways. And to think about how religion can be used to uplift or liberate people, as opposed to control and abuse them. So there are different liberation theologies. Pretty much any marginalized people group you can think of, there's a liberation theology for them that those groups have created. So there's, Black liberation theology. There's a Native American liberation theology. There's, queer liberation theology. There's different different countries have liberation theologies. There's Mingjung theology, which was originated in South Korea. There's Mujerista theology, which is a Latin American theology specifically created by Latino women. So it's about these different groups that have been historically kept out of the standard and mainstream ways we think about God and religion, and try to, restore their voices. And so
would this fall under progressive Christianity?
I would. That's a tricky one, because it is a progressive Christian theology for sure, but it's also often distinct from that, in the sense that a lot of progressive Christian theology these days is really just kind of a mirror of white evangelicalism. It's just like white progressivism.
Yeah, it seems a lot of cherry picking takes place sometimes. Yeah. That's from me looking from the outside.
Yeah, definitely. So, liberation theology, I feel like a lot of people make a distinction between conservative theology, progressive theology, and then a justice oriented or a liberationist theology. And those tend to be, because they do arise from marginalized people group, those tend to be theologies that are written by, people of color, and LGBTQIA folks. So it's a very different style and approach. And for me, with child liberation theology, I'm interested in looking at how religion has been used to control and abuse children. And I'm interested in looking at how we can criticize that and find different ways of looking at the same texts. And often that's not even a matter of trying to come up with new approaches. It's often a matter of thinking about how those texts have been used by those who first created them. It could be looking at Jewish interpretations of the Tanakh. For me, that's been a pretty interesting and healing experience. And I think people have different responses to religious trauma. Some people want nothing to do with religion after that. And, that's totally valid. Some people like to take a few years to wrestle with it, and then they want to have nothing to do with it. For me, I find meaning and healing in talking back to it. So I feel like I do find a lot of affinity with Jewish interpretations of the passages from the Tanakh.
What is the Tanakh?
The Tanakh would be what we would call the Old Testament in Christianity.
Okay.
And I just use that word because Jewish folks have expressed that, and it makes sense that when you refer to Old Testament, New Testament, you're kind of already just dismissing the entire Jewish tradition in the sense that, we're saying that their entire religion is old and has been replaced essentially. So
that's really interesting, and it makes sense to me that you would find some healing or relief looking at it through a Jewish lens. I mean, Judaism was certainly around before Christianity, and Christianity rather hijacked it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about, well, what did those people, so long ago, how did they actually think about things? Because it's just been an ever changing, evolving, story and interpretation. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. I'll bring up like one example just because it blew my mind recently, which is the story of Elisha and the 42 little children that were Elisha called the bears out to kill.
Yes.
After they taunted his baldness. It is a truly horrifying passage. And when I was researching that passage for my book, because I was like, I have to look at that passage.
Yes.
That's one of the most difficult ones. So I have to face it head on. And what was interesting to me was that when I was researching it, like all the articles that I found were essentially either from evangelicals or atheists. Like it was there was a very large debate over this one passage, and it was a very evangelical and atheist dominated debate. And I couldn't find anything else. I finally found like a comment on a blog post from like years ago that referenced the Talmud, which is the rabbinical texts that Judaism use. And in there it states that Elisha was actually punished by God because he let his anger and pride get the better of him. And that's how Jewish people have interpreted that passage. And that's not at all in the Old Testament. In fact, Elisha just goes off and he just continues his holy work, and you're just like, okay, I guess that that was holy. Like, and that's what all the evangelicals say essentially, is that clearly because Elisha curses the bears, he clearly used the power of God, so God must have sanctioned what he did, and so the children must be in the wrong. And so every interpretation is about imagining what these little children could possibly have done to justify being mauled to bears.
Right.
Which is horrifying. And they all do it.
Yeah.
And the really interesting part to me, and besides learning that Jewish folks have this very different take on the passage, was that all the evangelicals do when they try to justify the children being killed is that they increase the age of the children a little bit. They make them into teenagers.
Yeah.
But then they describe them as like hoodlums. They use the ghetto a lot. So they start using these racially coded terms.
Wow.
And so they all kind of do what is called the adultification bias, which is essentially treating Black children as older than they are. And so like all these interpretations are essentially this evangelicals saying, well, the children must have done something wrong, and imagine children in the ghetto. So like
so problematic. That is just despicable.
Yeah.
So your book, The Kingdom of Children, is looking at various passages taken from the Bible in places where terrible things were done to children or prescribed to children, or is that right?
Yeah, I look at both what I'd call the bad stories and then the good stories. I think that there are passages in the Bible where children are treated horribly. And then I think there's some passages where we see that children have immense capability and abilities to speak truth about the times that we live in. And so with the bad stories, like my approach to this really comes from my child protection background. Like I'm interested in looking at stories in the Bible where there's violence done against children and figuring out how we can learn from those texts in a way that helps us protect children today. Like I'm not interested in like defending the passages. I think that like what is violent and abusive and wrong in terms of how we treat people and children, like I feel like that is stable across cultures and time. So I feel comfortable like looking at those passages and saying like there's no way that should be considered right. And so if we're going to read those passages, let's read them in a way that can help us protect children today. So that's how I like to approach what I call the bad stories. And then looking at the good stories, I'm interested in, what can we learn from those in terms of how we should be interacting with children today, like understanding that children, have rights and they have a voice and that they should be listened to. Children can be what Christians would call like prophets or priests, like they can be teachers, they can be leaders in their communities. Like if we would only give them, the space and tools instead of, what we do now, which is just assume that they are, have not reached adulthood and therefore, they are not fully people, fully, human, or fully imaged after God, if you want to use religious language.
And it's demanded by a lot of Christian parents that those children, curiosity is not prized, only obedience is prized. So you're going to obey the first time, every time. You better live in fear of your father or your mother or whoever the authority figure is. You better not step out of line. And that's also sends just really terrible, fearful messages to children. It's not helpful. How is your message being received in the evangelical community? Does there seem to be an appetite for
it? There has been some response. It's all been very intense responses. Child liberation theology has officially been labeled a heresy by some evangelical websites, which I am proud of, I'll admit.
That's exciting. Well done.
Thank you.
If you're going to be branded a heretic.
Called me when I was scared of and accepting Jesus because I wanted to still see my brother in heaven, that I made a heresy. So it's going to be okay.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation about some things that I had never really considered before. So you've just finished your book. What's on the horizon for you?
I think that probably getting ready for the actual publication of the book. And then I also have a day job. I'm an election worker. So I am gearing up for the November election.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
That's like a serious undertaking this time around. That's for sure.
Yes. I think that elections are becoming increasingly important, and democracy is really fragile these days. So I feel like it's something that we need to be, all engaged and alert about. So this has been a great opportunity for me to be able to use some of my skills that I learned from homeschooling, like speech and debate. I'm giving a lot of presentations these days about election law. So that's come in really handy, actually.
Yeah. And are you still working with homeschoolers?
I don't really work with homeschoolers much these days. That's not really so much from me, more from homeschoolers themselves. I find it a challenge to get homeschoolers of any persuasion interested in talking about issues like child protection or mental health issues.
Yeah.
You and I know why the evangelicals don't want to talk about that, but the surprising part is that the more progressive homeschoolers, they often think that all the problems are with the evangelicals. So they don't realize that, these problems are universal problems that everyone should be, aware about. That's one of the messages of child liberation theology too, is that we all need to be engaged in the issue of children and how children are treated, even if we are not parents ourselves, even if we're don't have children at the moment. We all are responsible for each other, and
someday those kids are going to be running things.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the truth. Well, are you on social media or anywhere people can get a hold of you?
Yes, I am on Twitter. My handle is RL, and then my last name Stollar, STOLLAR. And then my website is my name there, which is rlstollar.com. So folks can find me there. And I do have information about child liberation theology. I also have a lot of resources about homeschooling, not just critiques of evangelical homeschoolers. I do have a lot of resources that any homeschoolers can use about child abuse prevention and mental health issues.
Excellent. Very helpful.
You have a couple curriculums there that are available for free.
Right on. Well, I'll get you to send me any information that you'd like to be included in the show notes, and I'm happy to do that. And Thank you for joining us on the Divorcing Religion podcast. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Be sure to subscribe to the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel so you never miss an episode of the Divorcing Religion podcast. And yes, we'll have more links in the show notes. Thanks so much, Ryan. It was a real delight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, everyone.